Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thanks especially if you've taken a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to someone you think might enjoy it. I am grateful. Thanks also to all of you who have already signed up for the Slee Rickets Secret Show. I just uploaded a new episode Friday. So go to sleerickets.substack.com to sign up now. There's also, kind of a cool new thing. I am still, if you go on there and you sign up for the free subscription, just put in your email address. That's all you got to do. I will give you a free week of The Secret Show. But on top of that, if you sign up for the free subscription, Substack now has a feature that allows me to send out a preview to all of the free subscribers. So you will get those about 3 times a month. That's what I'm aiming for, about 3 times a month. If I keep it up, I may end up increasing the annual rate. So sign up now so you can get your cheaper rate. I think that's all I was going to say about that. Oh, and we do have t-shirts with the logo in black as well as in white now, and a bunch of new colors. And we have hoodies. So go to the link on the show notes page to see the merch store. Still got a lot of really good correspondence. You got even more this week. So I am getting a show together that will largely just be digging into all of that juicy stuff. I got a great note from Ethan about Tiny Tim, and Cameron and I are going to tackle that one separately in a different episode, but I will be getting to all of that soon enough. For now, though, I have Cameron and Alice and I have a WhatsApp thread with Brian. We also, have a number of email threads talking. We've been talking a lot about difficulty lately. Some of that gets into the show, some of it doesn't. I think Alice is somewhere in the middle, and then Cameron and I are sort of on opposite ends of the question of difficulty in poetry. But we had a really great conversation about it while I was out of town. My audio is a little funny because Alice was nice enough to handle the recording end from Australia, but we talked for quite a long time. It was a really dense conversation. I don't really want to, I compressed it some, but I don't really want to cut much out. So I'm breaking it in half. I'm going to do half this week and half either next week or another week sometime soon. But it is all about difficulty, and I think you will enjoy it. So just real quick, because it has been on my mind, I'm going to talk about all this judging, poetry contest judging stuff I've been doing, because I have some thoughts on that. That's been a privilege and a trial. but I've been thinking about this question lately. So I have this pet peeve when it comes to language. There's a thing that people often say about language, that writers often say about language. And it occurred to me recently that specifically writers and poets in particular who praise or practice particularly difficult or dense or opaque poetry tend to say this thing a lot. The statement that has always rubbed me the wrong way is just this: words fail. Words fail. Sometimes they'll say language fails, words can't express, and so forth. But this is a pretty frequent topic of consideration for difficult poets. And, there's a very interesting poem Cameron and Alice and I have been digging into separately. We may get to it in another episode, but he made the point that he thinks that this, dense and long and difficult, but maybe impressive poem is about language. And I have often heard this, that a lot of really difficult, dense poems are about language. And I think that is probably a really worthwhile thing to write poetry about. I think that my own irritation at it is maybe a character flaw, but it's one that I think I was able to make a little bit more sense of this week. So I'm going to speak in extremely general terms here because I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but I will just say that while we were in Baltimore, my wife was in her medical school training and then her residency, which is an additional 4 years of training after medical school. she and her colleagues noticed that some of the medical students and certainly psychiatric residents, but I believe medical students as a whole are now majority female. Most of them are women, and some specialties like psychiatry overwhelmingly so. But they noticed that among the faculty, among the attendings, and especially among the senior attendings, it was only a minority who were women, and some of those female senior attendings, not all, not even most, but some, seemed to have maybe a special chip on their shoulder when it came to female residents and female medical students. Again, speaking only in the most general of terms, not talking about the psychiatric department in particular, but just speaking in very general terms. I think this is a phenomenon that occurs outside of medicine as well. That in some cases, women, older women who had, a particularly difficult time getting through training in an earlier generation, when it was much harder for women to get through, can sometimes take out some of that long stewing frustration on new female trainees, as if to say, you need to work as hard as I did. I hope you should have to suffer everything that I suffered. And I found myself having that response. I've always thought that was a rather ungenerous response, but I found myself having that response recently when Jonathan recommended this documentary series / reality show on Netflix called Love on the Spectrum. I ended up watching part of 2 different pilots because there's both an Australian version and an American version, but my response to both was more or less the same. Right? This is a show about adults with autism trying to date, trying to find love, sometimes with each other, often not with each other, but just trying to go out in the world and get into sexual or romantic or partnership relationships with other human beings. And my response to almost all of these people was, surprising to myself, was anger. I was so angry at them. I was so impatient with them. I wanted so much for them to stop being so weird and to think more about what was happening in the minds of the people they were talking to do a better job of imagining the other person's experience rather than getting so caught up in their own private obsessions. It made me so angry watching them indulge all of their weirdo impulses. And if that sounds especially uncharitable, it is uncharitable, but it is a lack of charity that I come by truly, because it reminded me so much of my own childhood and adolescence. The problem for me growing up was never words. I remember I was in 4th grade, I think, and a kid in my class got into some kind of trouble with the teachers, and he told me about it at recess, and I observed that they'd made a number of this sounds so fucking nerdy. I observed, in hearing his account, that they'd made a number of protocol of logical and policy-based errors. That is, that they had acted in a way that was inconsistent with the previous behavior or was not totally adherent to the school's code of conduct or handbook, or had involved an irrational assumption along the way. And so what did I do? Being fucking little nerd that I was, I wrote up on a piece of loose leaf a bullet-pointed list of fallacies that the teachers had committed. I know I sound like the worst kind of Redditor, but I swear Reddit didn't exist at the time, or at least I wasn't aware of it if it did. I wrote out all of their logical, all of the problems with their arguments, all of the problems with the 4th grade disciplinary charges that they had brought against him. And I gave them to him, and I said, well, you should go talk to them about and use this as a skeletal outline of your argument, because I think these are really your strongest points of debate with them. What did he do? Being the fucking moron that he was, he went to the teachers and he handed it over. He just gave them this loose leaf sheet of bullet points I'd made for him. The teachers came to me, and of course my first thought was, I had two thoughts. One was, oh, I'm in trouble now. And two was, I've been careful not to do anything that's against the rules. And I was totally unprepared for what I actually got, which was crying. The teacher was really hurt that I had spoken of her and of her thinking in such brutally logical terms, that I had treated my fellow classmate like I was some kind of lawyer, and it was my job to mess her up or to catch her out. And she thought of me as a good student and somebody who cared about her and the classroom and learn a good learning environment, and wasn't this fellow student of mine constantly disrupting the class, and wasn't he constantly bullying me? And both of those things were true. But I just behaved in a way that felt to me very rational and very precise in my language. And so many fucking times I had that problem, talking on the phone with girls, trying to interact with teachers anytime I disagreed with them. I got told by a girl in college at a dance, while she was dancing with me, she leaned close. I think she really meant to be helping me. She meant this as a kindness. But she leaned into my ear and she said, "You know, you'd fuck a lot more if you just shut up." And that's been the story of my life. And so it has been not that I have learned to shut up, but that I have learned that it's not words that fail. The words are just a limited set of tools. It would be like if you watched somebody get mugged, and sitting on the table next to him was a fucking chess set, and you said, you know, chess is supposed to be a game of combat, but chess pieces fail when it comes to real life. No, they don't fucking fail. No, the guy just got fucking mugged, and this is a chess set, and it's good at playing chess. Language is a set of tools. It's really amazingly good at what it does. It's people who are difficult. I know I sound a little bit like those who would argue that guns don't kill people, people kill people. I mean, you know, I hate to echo my fourth grade self, but they are right. You know, it is people who kill people. It's just the problem is that we can't make laws against the existence of people, whereas maybe we can regulate guns a little bit. Not to get into that fucking can of worms. But I realize that I have a special intolerance for those who use language in a way that accords only with their own private meanings. And this was the big lesson it took me for fucking ever in college to learn with my own poetry, was that it was not enough to use pretty words. It was not enough to combine them in interesting ways. It was not enough to be specific, to be original in my language. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to build impressive or consistent structures with sound or with typography. None of this was enough. I could be as fancy as I wanted in my language, and none of that would do. Because the thing I really had to get at, the big challenge, was crossing over into another person's mind, was imagining the reader's experience, the same incredibly onerous task that had been drilled into me since I was a fucking kid, that I'd been told over and over and over again I had to learn. And it's made me a particularly ungenerous viewer of Love on the Spectrum. And I think it's probably also made me an ungenerous reader of idiosyncratic poetry, of poetry that is fundamentally interested, as I think it was Cameron said of Alvin Feynman's poetry. No, it wasn't Cameron. I think it was Eric Smith. I had a really good text exchange with Eric about who loves Alvin Feynman's poetry. I think Eric was the one who said, and I hope I'm not embarrassing you because I think it was just a really lovely insight, but he said that he thought that Feynman was ultimately communicating with himself in his poems. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to communicate with yourself. But that's maybe really notably what he's, not the only thing that he's doing, but the notable thing that he's doing is he's communicating with himself. And I think, I believe that some people can take real pleasure in observing that. I fear that I can't. I fear that it just makes me want to slap him silly and say, stop being such a fucking weirdo. Crumple up your fucking loose leaf. Stop being a nerd. Go take some acting classes and learn how to sit up straight and look your peers in the eye. Give a firm handshake. And if you would just shut your goddamn mouth, then you might fuck a lot more.
I'm really interested in sort of face-to-face poetry communities because I'm very young obviously, but I've never experienced that. I've experienced because I don't live with anyone who likes poetry that much. So the people I correspond with poetry is like the people who I email. So Shane, Matthew, a few other people. They're the only sort of contacts I have with poetry and a few online forums. So that's very much sort of much more, I guess, but when you're emailing someone, you're like writing letters to people like Emily Dickinson did. It's a much more sort of controlled and formulated conversation. While so I'm really interested in sort of poetry communities in the flesh because they're much more sort of human in that way, right? Because you're just face to face with someone just talking spontaneously.
Yeah. Matthew's just popped up. I think that's really normal. Like I've found that, up until, I don't know, like 3 weeks ago, that was the case for me. And I just basically talk to people by email and stuff like that. And yeah, I certainly didn't find my people in London. Oh my God, he's making so much noise. What are you doing, bro?
Sounds like he's building something.
He's building something. Hey, man. Can you hear us? You probably, I don't think you can.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
Let
cool.
me get my things hooked up. Oh, man.
I'm pretty sure it isn't this, but the way your volume is, Matthew, it sounds like you're literally lifting and throwing down weights. It's really amusing how loud it is.
Yeah, no, exactly. It feels about the same. How's life? You're still in with your family for the
Yeah. It's all right. I entered another 7-day poetry. Like April Napo. I entered like a mini version of that where it's writing for 7 days, and it's the 5th day. So I should have written and posted 5 poems. Unfortunately, I've only written and posted 4 poems. You start with high hopes, and they sort of fizzle away.
I'm back.
I know the experience. Hey, Alice.
Oh, Alice, I'd like to ask you about Mehegan's class. Actually, is that how you say his name? Is it Joshua Mehegan or Megan?
I think it's Megan. I think it's just Megan. Yeah. What would you like to know?
Ooh, I'm just very interested in. I haven't got any specific questions. I'm just very interested in the whole experience, how he teaches you. Because I know Matthew loves Joshua, and I've read some of his poems, and I like them. I really admire his triolets. There's a lot. I think they're sort of. The modern triolet seems to be an exercise in altering your punctuation to create new meanings. And what I really like about the triolets I read on Poetry Foundation by Joshua were that he just didn't alter his punctuation, and the new meaning was acquired through build-up of sense in the other lines, which I thought was very skillful and quite refreshing. So no, but I haven't got any specific questions, Alice. I'm just quite curious to know how actually, my question is, how does he teach you free verse? How does he go about that?
Well, we've done a different sort of type of free verse each week. So, and kind of starting out with like going from more to less structure. So the first week we looked at rhetorical modes of organizing a poem. We looked at use of typography. We looked at, now I'm going to forget what we did. We looked at like using metrical forms in an improvisatory way. And now the last week, the challenge is like, all right, so given everything that we've talked about, all the different modes, play around and bring them all together. But yeah, let me bring up my notes here because he just says so many amazing things. I mean, the first thing he asked us was like, can you define free verse in a positive way? Can you define it without saying, oh, well, it doesn't rhyme or it doesn't have rules? And I still haven't been able to do that. So I don't know. He just asks great questions. He just knows everything, and he's extremely kind in his feedback.
I can't think of a good answer.
I mean, even vers liber is a negation. It's just French. It makes it sound a bit posher.
Exactly. Yeah.
There is a slight difference that, and I use vers libre, however you want to say it, as the distinction. But that, of course, just as you said, Cameron, just is a fancy French way of saying free verse. But there is the thing that happens in Dover Beach. That is iambs with rhymes, but the rhymes are irregular and the lines are of an irregular number of iambs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not free verse as we would call it, but it is something, and it's not regular metrical. I mean, it's not regular, meter or stanzaic meter.
Yeah, sure. It's not 19th century regular meter. I mean, if someone were to write in sort of Dover Beach now, it would be considered pretty metrical, wouldn't it? But yeah, definitely, it's not.
Yeah, it just seems like that deserves a category. Like that is a thing,
Love Song of Alfred Prufrock is pretty metrical.
Yeah, it's similar. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the Red Wheelbarrow. We had a conversation about this, didn't we? Right at the beginning of when we first used WhatsApp, because the Red Wheelbarrow there's like an argument whether you can read it within line breaks or within stiches.
The more, I don't know, the more something is in free verse, and I guess particularly if you don't have rhyme and you're breaking the lines so as to disguise the meter, and there's not an additional context that would suggest that one should look for a meter, I start to begin to feel a little bit agnostic about what it means to discover meter there,
I think you're right. I think what annoys me is a lot of sort of websites go, it's their key definition of what a free verse poem is, and they throw the Red Wheelbarrow into sort of play. And it is pretty free verse in that sense, but I also think it deserves more than what a lot of sort of websites give it. But then I guess most poetry deserves more than what most websites give it. I guess, it goes back to what is it, the AUA? Oh, you say AUA, and I always think AMA, and then I get confused. I also asked the AUA.
I'm just calling it AMA, but yeah, it is. I guess it should be an AUA.
Yeah, I asked Alison or whatever, and about how much understanding stress comes down into free verse. I guess because it certainly has for me. The more and more I write in meter, the more free verse I also start thinking about the meter of that and how it's broken, how it isn't. So I guess I wonder if that happens for you, Alice, at all.
Everything I know about meter, I only know because I did that class with Josh. Since then I've kind of bought a whole bunch of books on it, and then I open them and go, oh, this is really boring, and then I close them again. But I think it's one of those things, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Totally.
And you start to realize, like, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot from the class over the last week or so is, at one point he just asked us, what is your line doing? And there's so many poems of mine that I look back at and go, yeah, I just broke the line there because I felt like it.
Yeah.
Which I'm not satisfied with that anymore now that that question's been asked of me.
I think at times it's okay to break a line because you feel sort of instinctually that it needs to be broken there. But I guess there's a difference there between feeling a sudden impulse to enter it into, sort of force a word into an in-jam position, and also just needing to break a line because you needed a line break, right? Yeah.
The other thing that Josh says is, like, not every line break has to be some kind of amazing coup, but
right. Yeah.
It's great if there is a reason, even if it's just a small kind of negligible one, I suppose.
This has something to do with, like, what feels to me like the heart of the problem or question or tug of war about difficulty, which is this sort of funny middle ground between the author's intention and the reader's sense of an implied intention, like, which isn't necessarily as simple as, like, I want you to learn this lesson and go vote for this person because you read this poem. But, like, I think like we can get into Reginald Shepard's, I think, very useful set of categories of different sorts of difficulty. But when he talks about modal difficulty, I think he gets close to this question, which is, like, the kind of problem we have with a poem when we say, if this is a poem, I don't get what you think a poem is, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm totally with you, Cameron, and saying like, it doesn't, if you have an instinct that says break it here, break it there, and that's just as much of a justification as we have for many of the choices we make in any poem. But the problem maybe emerges when there's not a sense that the reader can get hold of that like the thing that is happening has anything to it. Like if it's like, I guess there's a difference between breaking something because of like doing something because of instinct and doing something truly arbitrarily.
Right. Yeah. Sense. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Because presumably, hopefully, your instinct is going to like pay off. It's going to get it's coming from something that maybe you can't put your finger on, but it has an effect.
But what happens in difficult poetry when there's an instinct on the reader's part, an instinct on the poet's part, but for the reader it comes across as arbitrary, and they can't sense any instinct there at all, right? Because then that is just, for all intents and purposes, that is just arbitrariness, because the poet is not the reader. The poet isn't the audience.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that does happen a lot. And part of the question maybe, is it for every reader? Is it for some readers? Is the writer just essentially I think like the old definition of idiot is like specifically that you're alone. You're like, everything is just to yourself in your own head. And you're not able to access, like you can't access other people or give them access to what's going on in your head. Okay. And that does happen, I think, with a lot of poetry, but like I tend to be very skeptical about the value of intention beyond like even scientists today will talk about biological organisms as being designed in a certain way, just like without even thinking. Like a doctor will say like, oh, well, fruit is designed to get you your fiber because it's sweet, but it also delivers, this stuff that you need for your digestion. And I think when we identify a value in something, we sort of reverse engineer an intention. And I think that's the degree to which intention matters in poetry. I think it's like very common for the author to have lots on his mind that the reader doesn't pick up on. But maybe the question is, how much is a reader able to get out of what happened, whether or not, because that's the other thing is like, if a reader senses something in a poem, I don't think it matters whether or not the author meant to do that. It matters that it works. Like you get credit for anything that works, whether or not you planned it.
I want to start with my boyfriend, Jeffrey Hill. He does this interview about difficulty that I think you sent through, Cameron. And he says so many great things, but I think one of the best things that sort of solves this whole question immediately is I think art has a right, not an obligation, to be difficult if it wishes. And to me that kind of just solves it all, because it says we can have both. We can have difficulty, we can have simplicity. You're allowed to be difficult if you want. You don't have to be.
Strong disagree. No, I think you're of course you're right that like art, we can have all kinds, and I'm glad we have all kinds. I think he's extremely well spoken, and as Carl Phillips, who interviews him, says he was really nervous, and you can imagine that, of course, being nervous going to interview fucking Jeffrey Hill at his house. But then he also says that he was just like a delightful, lovely, warm host, and just like a wonderful person to sit down and listen to, sitting next to his life-size dollhouse, which is a phrase that threw me because I kept thinking, isn't a life-size dollhouse just a house? but he has one in his house, and he's just sat scowling next to it without acknowledging its presence at all, and then talked shop brilliantly with Carl Phillips for however long this interview goes. Before I had to stop at the paywall, but it just seemed like it could have gone on forever. Both he and his wife seem just like a brilliant, lovely. Just going to a dinner party at their house would be like magical. Absolutely. But I strongly disagree with at least some of what he says in here, I think.
Oh, okay.
Well, I suspect that one of the things you would probably disagree with, given your article, which I know you wrote over 10 years ago, so you might not agree with all of it, but he goes on to talk about tyranny requiring simplification. And one of the things the tyrant most cunningly engineers is the gross oversimplification of language. I suspect that might be where you guys diverge.
That is where I most agree with him.
Oh, wrong again.
No, I mean, he's whatever he's saying, it's always said so well and interestingly that I'm glad he said, whether it's with magic quotation marks or not, I enjoy all of his utterances. But I do think that Carl Phillips raises sort of the central question, and then Geoffrey Hill breezes right past it with a funny joke, and then talks almost totally beside the point for most of the passage that's, I think, best known, which you read from. So Carl Phillips says, "What comes up often in reviews of your work is the idea of an overly intellectual bent. In recent reviews of The Triumph of Love, often the word difficult comes up. People mention that it's worth going through, or it isn't worth going through. And that question of worth going through, to me, is the central question." And that's what Geoffrey Hill then totally blows off. He says, "Like a Victorian wedding night," yes, which is a pretty good joke.
So good.
And then he says, "Let's take difficulty first." And this is a passage I've heard quoted in full and in part a number of times, very smartly and very well, because it is a good passage. He says, "Let's take difficulty first. We are difficult. Human beings are difficult. We're difficult to ourselves. We're difficult to each other. And we are mysteries to ourselves. We are mysteries to each other. One encounters in any ordinary day far more real difficulty than one confronts in the most intellectual piece of work. Why is it believed that poetry, prose, painting, music should be less than we are? Why does poetry have to address us in simplified terms, when, if such simplification were applied to a description of our own inner selves, we would find it demeaning? I think art has a right, not an obligation, to be difficult if it wishes. And since people generally go on from this to talk about elitism versus democracy, I would add that genuinely difficult art is truly democratic, and that tyranny requires simplification. This thought does not originate with me. It's been far better expressed by others." I'm not going to read the whole long passage, but I do like that he concludes his section on difficulty. And he gets to the tyranny part, which I do want to talk about in a second. But I just love that he concludes a section on difficulty by saying, "So much for difficulty. Now let's take the other aspect." And that's so much for difficulty. Cameron, I wanted to ask you, because you're an Oxonian. Is that what y'all weirdly call it?
Some people weirdly call it. I refuse to.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. And an Englishman, is "so much for X," does that originate with Hamlet, or is that just the first usage I know of, where Claudius says "so much for him" in that early speech? I feel like that's the first. I don't know of another earlier usage of that construction as like a conversational device.
There's was it Milton invented the most phrases, and then Shakespeare did it after Milton? So I'm gonna bet
that seems likely
originated the phrase.
It also confirms my partly, like, whenever I imagine Geoffrey Hill, I realize that half the time I'm actually imagining Derek Jacobi.
Derek Jacobi is such a good actor.
Well, right. I mean, so part of that, what that then makes me want is like both for Derek Jacobi to play Geoffrey Hill, and it makes me want Geoffrey Hill to be alive again so he can play Claudius. Wouldn't he be a good Claudius?
He would be.
But yeah, so this passage on difficulty.
Would he be a good Polonius?
Yeah,
maybe he would be a good.
Yeah.
Maybe he's too eloquent for Polonius.
I mean, he would be a little bit wasted just because you'd want him to have more lines, but he would do it well. And in fact, like a Polonius who has a little bit of spite to him, like a little bit of edge, would be a kind of a nice, because he's usually played as like harmless, which I think is kind of unfair to him. So like a Polonius
Yeah,
who
yeah.
is also a little bit dangerous would, because he is dangerous. Like he like orders people to do very, like he is a powerful figure, even if he's sort of foolish. But yeah, no, he
Hmm.
could be a very good Polonius. I think you're right.
Wait.
I would.
Polonius is Ophelia's dad.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. When we just saw Hamlet recently, Polonius was like really, really scheming, and it worked really well. But yeah, I mean, Geoffrey Hill would be good at anything. Come on.
I heard someone say that Geoffrey Hill is the voice of God.
He's the voice of like a god from like certain portions of the Bible. Like he's like if Morgan Freeman is like a like the god you want to meet, and you feel like Geoffrey Hill is the god you do meet. like, oh, I was hoping for Morgan Freeman. Shit, this is not going to go well.
Like a sort of cheap, accessible poet, and you've lived your life, you die, and you go to heaven. You're confronted by Geoffrey Hill to give you a lecture.
Right, Rod McHugh ascends to heaven, and it's Geoffrey Hill before the fact. It's a scary day.
We've
but we totally got off topic.
Well,
so I just think he. Sorry, go ahead, Alice. Yeah.
Well, I feel like this conversation would benefit from bringing in some actual work, so we can talk about whether it's
let's do that.
Because this triumph of love that the interview is a little bit about, I read the bits that were available on Poetry Foundation, and I'm reading it and thinking, this doesn't seem very difficult to me. Yeah, so I thought I just pulled out a couple of stanzas that seemed relevant.
Yeah.
So this is part of it. Even now, I tell myself, there is a language to which I might speak and which would rightly hear me, responding with eloquence in its turn, negotiating sense without insult given or injury taken. Familiar to those who already know it, elsewhere as justice, it is met also in the form of silence. And then I think this is right at the end, or at the end of the section that's available. What ought a poem to be? Answer, a sad and angry consolation. What is the poem? What figures? Say, a sad and angry consolation. That's beautiful. Once more, a sad and angry consolation. I mean, I don't know. That doesn't pose any issues for me. It's not like exactly syntactically straightforward.
There'll be some noise. I'm just getting on the triumph of love.
Yeah, no. I mean that second part is not difficult at all. Would you read the first part again? Because I just there's so many abstractions. I lost myself. I need to hear it again.
Yeah. Even now I tell myself, there is a language to which I might speak and which would rightly hear me, responding with eloquence in its turn, negotiating sense without insult given or injury taken. Familiar to those who already know it, elsewhere as justice, it is met also in the form of silence. I mean, I can't like turn around and tell you exactly what that means, but I know that I like it. I know that it gives me a certain feeling, it makes me feel something.
It certainly isn't the parts of the triumph of love that are sort of have an abiding sense of searching through other writers, which I think is where most of the accusations of difficulty come from.
Oh, okay.
Because of the Poetry Foundation obviously pick the parts that they think are either the best or sort of best suit the selection, whatever sort of aims of selection they want to take from the poem.
Right.
So the first stanza of the Triumph of Love is divided into Roman numerical stanzas. I don't know if it gets to 100, but at least either 100 or 50, a large amount of them. The first stanza is one line, and it says, "Sun blazed over Romesley, a livid rain scarp." And then that is quite beautiful. And then, can I just read out the next section? Because I think this is where you sort of see more of the denseness of illusion.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, "Guilts were incurred in that place. Now I am convinced. The self-molestation of the child soul. Would that be it? 3. Petronius, arbiter, take us in charge. Carry us with you to the house of corrections. Angelus Silvius, guide us while we are there." So I think from that is sections 1, 2, and 3, and it gets a bit denser than that. For instance, when you to the sad and angry constellation, which is probably the most famous lines and definitely one of the most beautiful lines from it, is a quote from Leopardi, and he talks about Leopardi in it, and then unearths those lines and riffs on them, and that's where you get a section talking about say again the sad and angry constellation. I totally agree with you, Addison. I love The Triumph of Love, not as much as some of Hill's other poems. I don't think it's the greatest one of his sort of later long poems, but it's certainly got very good moments. But I also think maybe the selections from Poetry Foundation don't quite do justice to the amount of intellectual referencing that is in that. But I also don't think the referencing of other poets and writers is not worth it. I think it is worth it. I think that difficulty is worth it, because the amount of riches the reader will take away from the poem, I think, is vast if you put your mind to it. And I guess, is that what you're getting at, Matthew, when you talk about Hill dodging around the worth element of Philip's question?
I think so, because I think that by saying like life is difficult, we are difficult, our day is difficult, he's saying like, oh, so then do you think poetry should be dumber and simpler than that? And that's a straw man, right? I mean, he says like, well, if you want simplicity, then you want business slogans and, political cheers. And that is brutally, horribly simplistic, and simplistic even in a kind of a weirdly opaque way. But I think that he's missing that, like, part of the human response to difficulty is an attempt it is difficult to be easy to other people. Like, it's difficult to be clear. It's difficult to be welcoming. It's difficult to take pain. You have to take pains in order to be kind to others. And I think of the old virtue of gentleness, which is that, our natural state, especially if we are hungry, if we're poor, if we're cold, our natural state is to be mean and to be rough and hard. And it takes both luxury and discipline to be gentle. Like, you have to have the wherewithal to not be scrapping over every little bit that you can fight over, but you also then have to learn and work hard to restrain yourself and to be kind to others, to hold back, not to restrain yourself, to put yourself in someone else's shoes. That's part of the great work of love, of community, of knowing somebody and becoming close to somebody, and that does involve then, like, there are times when we do want our friends to be difficult. Like, we want to say, like, hey, go ahead and let me help you with this. Go ahead and like, let me carry some of the burden. Let me go ahead and be difficult, and I'll be in it with you. But what precedes that is gentleness. And I think like part of why we are, like, the world and life is hard and is difficult in a way that is partly because it doesn't give a shit about us. And then we do our best to give a shit about other people and make ourselves gentle to them. And then that makes it worth doing the hard things, right? That, like, then you say, like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and, take care of you when you're sick, or like have a kid, or help you move, or listen to your problems. Like, the difficulty is definitely, you don't want there never to be difficulty, but the difficulty is not the cause. Difficulty goes without saying. Difficulty is the easy part in a way. Like, difficulty is cheap, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And that kind of hospitality, which I think is a better term for it than like ease or simplicity. Hospitality is extremely expensive and very valuable for that reason. I do think, like, when you get to the political slogans and the tyrannical speech, he says later, he's talking about Hacker, whom I don't know, but he's saying basically someone else said this better than I did. He says, Hacker argues with specific reference to the Nazis that one of the things the tyrant most cunningly engineers, as Alice read earlier, is the gross oversimplification of language, because propaganda requires that the minds of the collective respond primitively to slogans of incitement. And any complexity of language, any ambiguity, any ambivalence implies intelligence. Maybe an intelligence under threat, maybe an intelligence that is afraid of consequences, but nonetheless an intelligence working in qualifications and revelations, resisting therefore tyrannical simplification. That is where I'm totally with him. I have no developed thought about that. I just have a strong awareness of and fear of oversimplified political speech. But I just think it's the thing that Carl Phillips points out as worth, and that's what Hill misses. Saying that, like, I've not read a lot of Hill, but I do think that when I have read him, for the most part, he does seem to be worth it, and that's because his work is not difficult in that raw, mean, barbaric way, right? It's difficult in a way that, at its best, at least the best stuff I've read, that involves that welcome. It involves that the same thing that Carl Phillips found when he went to his house, which was that Geoffrey Hill was a good host, welcomed, and like made it feel good to sit down and talk with him, and then made it feel good to go on those more difficult parts of the conversation. So I think that is what good poetry does, but I think he's sort of skipping over the real nub of the matter, because when I read language poets, when I read flourish poets, when I read a lot of John Berryman, not John Berryman, John Ashbery. When I read a lot of John Ashbery, I don't encounter gentleness. I just encounter, if not barbarism, it's sort of an indifference, that kind of difficulty, which again, indifference is cheap. Indifference is, you find that on the subway, right? That is, you're right. He's right that you can find that anywhere, but he's not right that therefore our poetry should be that way.
Yeah, I feel like what you are circling around here, Matthew, is the connection between, is this sense of laziness, like poetry just sort of being difficult because the poet didn't bother to take the time. Yeah. I would never put Ashbery in that category. And the reason I can forgive Ashbery all his difficulty is that I genuinely feel like he doesn't mind what you take from his poems. I think they're all written really quickly. Yep. He's said as much. And I think it's sort of like, take it or leave it, And there's a lot of beauty and there's a lot of confusion and a lot of stuff that's really irritating. But, we ended up putting him on a huge pedestal, but I don't think he ever really asked for that.
No.
But
I wouldn't necessarily say that, for me at least, I don't think it's a matter of like insufficient effort so much as it tends to be a matter of insufficient care. So I think laziness is related, but not quite, at least the way I feel about it, right?
Can we dig into a little bit?
Yeah. Please,
Can we dig in a little bit into the difference between effort and care? Because it seems very interesting. Because I guess what I'd ask Alice is, I find it certainly disconcerting that Ashbery wrote his poems very quickly. I don't like that, and that makes me like Ashbery a little bit less, because I guess where Matthew is more interested in care, I'm more interested in effort. And if I feel that the poet isn't sort of taking language seriously enough, then I don't know if I want to take their writing very seriously. I don't mean sort of seriously in a sort of pretentious, unamused way. I mean more in sort of, don't know if I want to spend time with their writing if they haven't at first spent time with it. So I guess that's what, because you must be a bit different to that, Alice, if you like. I like a lot of Ashbery. Some Trees from his first collection is one of my favorite poems of all time, but I do dislike a lot of Ashbery, and I'm rather ambiguous towards Ashbery on the whole. So I just wonder if you learn that a poet doesn't spend time over their poems, Alice, do you think any less of the poems and the poet for it, or do you still take just the poems as objects for your interest and totally disassociate the poet taking time or not taking time in them at all from the poems?
I don't dissociate it. And I know, I mean, Some Trees is one of my favorites as well, and I know that he did spend time on that one. I think when I think about this, I think about I lived in Japan for a little bit and I learned calligraphy, and the way that they teach you to do that is just to write the same character over and over again, and you realize that it's not actually, it's about the practice, yes, but there's going to come a moment where you write that character perfectly, and that's going to be, it's going to feel like it's by magic. I think about that when I think about Ashbery, and I think about the poets who I really, really love over here, who, whether they write quickly or not, the result often feels like that to me. It's like they've, obviously Ashbery's a genius, like a giant intellect. So when he lands somewhere, when he has that kind of perfect moment, it seems almost like it's by chance. And it might be surrounded by a lot of confusing bullshit, essentially. And yeah, I mean, I've tried to read a poem like The Skaters, for example. Like I couldn't give a fuck. Like I'm not going to read that thing. But when I look at it, I think, okay, well, he's just kind of amusing himself, and there might be some pleasure here or there might not. I personally don't have the patience, but yeah, I just keep coming back to that idea of like, the poem might take 20 minutes, but what got you to that 20 minutes is what matters.
Yeah, I think you're talking about like skill, and I was just going to try to find if there's a good, and y'all may both be better at this than I am, if there's a good shortish Ashbery poem to read to give people something in their ears. But I'm totally with you in thinking about like there are skills, and like I don't care at all how long a particular poem took, because I know not only are there masterpieces that came quickly, but there are also plenty of examples of like poets slaving over something for months and even years, and they just need to throw it away. They just need to, they just need to give up on it.
Yeah, I guess I want to revise what I said a little bit, because obviously I think a great poem can be written in a certain amount of time that might be short. But I guess that skill is sort of, as Alice was talking about, writing the same symbol, you build up a certain level of skill over time. And if you're a genius like Ashbery, you build up a large amount of skill, both from sort of instinctual natural gifts and from continuous technique, to a point where you can write a poem out of that built up technique. So that in that sense, the poem has, even if not the single specific poem, but just the technique of any one given poem has been considered over for a long time. What I guess I'm a little bit more cold towards is the idea that he dashes off the poems and then pays little attention to the language of the poems, or at least gives them as much significance as it amuses me here now, so I'll write this down. I guess I find that a little cold, or at least that doesn't approach my specific taste in poetry. Yeah, sorry, go on, Matthew.
Oh, no, and just to clarify, you mean like what bothers you is the appearance that he is not putting care into, or putting effort into making the poem as rich or as worthwhile as it could be.
Yeah, or like more than not putting effort into something as not putting effort into a poem more than just that the poem is amusing or amuses him for the moment,
right?
In the right
moment. And I think I come out on the same end as you, but it's partly, for me, it has more to do with his not caring about the reader's experience. Because I think like there's also Hart Crane, say, who, it's hard to think of anybody who put more effort into making every word as meaningful as possible. And in a Hart Crane poem, that there's going to be like that in theory there could be a whole essay written about every line, and every word is gonna have 12 different aspects of meaning to it. That already exhausts me, and what irritates me about that, what puts me off from that kind of poem, is that he seems to be doing all of that. I know he's putting a lot of effort into it, but it's all for himself. That it doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to involve any care for the reader's experience. So, which is why, like, though I think Ashbery may be lazier than Crane, but the result for me is that they both feel like they don't care about my experience as a reader. So I encounter their poems in very much the same way, even though I totally believe Hart Crane worked a lot harder over every word.
But so you find, so as in Hart Crane's putting so much meaning to a line bit just becomes too time consuming for a reader, and that's why he doesn't care. I'm a bit confused about what you mean by not caring for the reader in that sense.
Well, I guess, like, if you show me your poem and I say, oh, this is a little hard to follow, or this is a little dense, and then you say, well, I can prove to you in a very convincing way how much meaning is crammed into here and how many allusions there are and how many different ways you could read this, and you can give me a lengthy and complex and even persuasive explication of the whole poem, I may believe you, and what I would be inclined to say then is, wow, that's impressive. It's not for me. But to me, all of that work is not the work of saying, how is this going to strike somebody's ear? How is this going to appear to somebody who walks into the room and encounters this for the first time? That's a particular kind of work that I think is just a different thing. And if you're not doing that work, then I tend not to be inclined to want to spend much time with your poems.
I was just going to say, can I read a little Ashbery so that we have a little bit?
Yeah, please. Did you find what did you find?
So this is my, I keep saying Some Trees is my favorite, but this is far and away my favorite of his. And it is pretty simple. Okay, so it's called The History of My Life. Once upon a time, there were two brothers. Then there was only one, myself. I grew up very fast before learning to drive even. There was I, a stinking adult. I thought of developing interests someone might take an interest in. No soap. I became very weepy for what had seemed like the pleasant early years. As I aged increasingly, I also grew more charitable with regard to my thoughts and ideas, thinking them at least as good as the next man's. Then a great devouring cloud came and loitered on the horizon, drinking it up for what seemed like months or years.
Would you mind reading that again, please?
Yep. Okay. A History of My Life. Once upon a time, there were two brothers. Then there was only one, myself. I grew up very fast before learning to drive even. There was I, a stinking adult. I thought of developing interests someone might take an interest in. No soap. I became very weepy for what had seemed like the pleasant early years. As I aged increasingly, I also grew more charitable with regard to my thoughts and ideas, thinking them at least as good as the next man's. Then a great devouring cloud came and loitered on the horizon, drinking it up for what seemed like months or years.
Yeah.
I like it. I don't love it. A lot of it strikes me as just straight up autobiographical, though. Like, it doesn't strike me as a Ashbery calling card in terms of sort of elusive jumping around from unconnected phrase to the next. It does strike me as very Ashberyan and sort of a very casual and yet somehow almost bardic voice.
Yeah, it is. I think essentially it's a whole autobiography in whatever 12 lines or something like that.
Right. I mean, he was setting a stage and putting characters on it and giving them attributes and telling you things about them, and they were such that you could build on what you had already digested. When you give a reader something, you're sort of asking him to keep a ball in the air, and you give him some more balls to keep in the air. And you have to be thoughtful about what you're asking him to keep track of and integrate into his understanding. And I think in that poem, he gets to a sort of a strange and ambiguous, possibly symbolic, image at the end. But before he's gotten there, he's given us a pretty clear, recognizable, manageable enough world to digest, so that then by the time we get to this big weird cloud that's devouring the horizon, we know what to stick it in. And so, I'm kind of with Cameron and finding, like, I like that poem and I find it evocative and a little bit eerie. I'm not greatly moved by it, but I do feel as if it was written with an understanding of people's ability to take it in. When I read other poems of his, and unfortunately, like the one that immediately came to mind was the one I already wrote about in that essay a million years ago. But in his other poems, I often find that he throws a ball at you. He gives you, he starts to set the stage, but then he sets a different stage, and then he puts some more stuff on there that doesn't match up with what he already put on there. And so by the time you get to the end, you have so many different elements to keep track of. You don't know how to bring them all together. You certainly don't know how he brings them all together. And then he just leaves you like somebody who like says he's going to get up to go to the bathroom and then just ditches you with the bill. That's the experience I have reading most Ashbery poems.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so here's the thing. It's the difference between caring whether you keep all the balls in the air or not. Ashbery doesn't mind if you drop a ball.
That was the first half of my conversation with Alice and Cameron about difficulty. The second half will be coming soon. I think I'm going to put it on the main feed. I'm not sure. I've got some interesting stuff coming up. I don't know exactly how I'm going to break it all down, but will be more episodes coming on the Secret Show feed as well. Please do go to sleeverickets.substack.com and sign up today, either to support the show and get a bunch of free episodes, or just for the free subscription. You will get previews, and for a week you will have access to all 13 episodes of The Secret Show that are up now. Thank you so much for listening. You can reach me as always at sleeverickets@gmail.com, and with any luck I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.